Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We'll get started again. Thank you so much. This was an incredible tafsir. We were just saying here that you're not going to get this anywhere except anything like this except here. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. Shall we start? Oh, actually, before we begin, we have been doing our own Taraweeh prayers here at night, and we thought that since we live stream our khutbah and our Jummah prayers, that if anyone would like to join us virtually for Taraweeh, that we would be happy to start live streaming that this evening. So we'll do it tonight at 10 o'clock our time, Eastern time. So just to let you know, and please join us. So if you like, you want to say anything else about that?
No.
Okay.
Join us.
Okay. All right. Should we start with questions here?
In verse 4, it talked about the atrocities that Pharaoh's people were committing, one of them being the assault of the women, and the specific word that was used was yastahi.
Yastahi nisa'ahum, yeah.
And then in verse 25, you were talking about Musa's wife-to-be approaching him. And again, it uses that word, that verb, astahya or astihya. I was wondering if there's any connection between that.
I mean, the connection.
Repeat the question, please.
The expression, Quranic expression used for what happened to the women, the Israelite women, is yastahi nisa'ahum, which could mean either sexually assault or sexually harass, or to force into prostitution. That's also a form of istihya. But when describing the woman that is approaching the Prophet Moses alayhi salam, that she approaches him ala istihya, and Shaina is asking if there is any connection between these two. I think the connection is linguistic, because both words are derived from haya, and haya is in turn derived from haya. But haya means modesty or shame or embarrassment or bashfulness. That's haya, and it was in old Arabic, in old Arabic poetry. Haya, bashfulness, was actually taken as a sign of someone who's very alive. Someone who has no haya was someone who's practically dead. Sort of like their senses are dead. But if you are still bashful, you still still get embarrassed, or then that means you're still sensitive, and so you're still alive. But then the when you say أتيت على استحياء, like I came على استحياء, here it would the context would mean that I have come somewhat bashfully, or I've come hesitantly. But if you say استحييت البيت, means I violated the sanctity of the home. Like literally, I've entered the home without bashfulness. So it all goes back to the same root, but it is the context that determines the meaning.
Any other questions here? Okay, processing. It's a heavy surah, so it takes a little while to get the questions going. So I'll start over here. Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak. My question pertains to the Tawasim, the surahs that start with Ta, Sin, Mim. Is there anything significant about these surahs, or what interpretations for Ta, Sin, Mim are there? Forgive me if this was discussed and I missed it.
Yeah, we talked about the Tawasim. A few halaqas back, I don't remember. I think it was Shara and there was one before Shara. But I mean, there are the Hawamim, the ones that would start with Hamim, and there's the Tawasim, and the ones that start with Sin Mim. And overall, and this is in my opinion, the Hawamim tend to communicate something that has to do with the core of an individual's ethics, the type of ethical transformation that must take place within an individual. While the Tawasim tend to communicate something about social transformation, public transformation. Do they relate to what the Hawamim or the Hamim generally are taken to connote the name of Ar-Rahman, and the Tawasim are generally taken to connote the essence of Malik al-Mulk. And I think the connection is, in my opinion, is rather clear, that Ar-Rahman is always talking to our inner core, part and parcel of us. Malik al-Mulk, Al-Quddus al-Malik, is the Lord, the King, that is telling us if we want to create a moral order, what would be needed. And I think, although this is one of those things that I had been very hesitant to share for about 10 years, but I think that will bear out. I think that theory will stand the test of time if people go back and analyze it. And Allahu Alam.
Thank you. I have a question about verse 10. What is the difference between fuad and qalb?
Well, before I answer linguistically, let me look at. In this context, fu'ad is, well, I mean, generally in linguistically, fu'ad is how do I put it? Is not simply the heart as an organ, but it is the muhja. It is the it's like literally your entire chest cavity, which would include your heart, your lungs. It is that when you feel like your heart has been ripped out, so that your chest is completely empty. That's a fu'ad. Although in poetry they tend to think fu'ad is more eloquent than qalb, but there is a slight difference in meaning. You should, if you say that your fu'ad has been terrified, so let's say if you use a strange expression, instead of say akhafa qalbi, you'd say akhafa fu'adi. That means that something has terrified your very core, not just your heart. And it probably also means that maybe if you say it in the context of a battle, then that probably means you're a coward. Well, it's acceptable to have your heart be scared in battle, but to have your fu'ad be scared in battle, that means you spineless. So when in this verse it says that her fu'ad became farigh, it's as if she felt her entire chest cavity being, so it's like connoting the depths of her sorrow or the depths of her anguish. While arabta qalb, to comfort someone's heart, it literally means that now you're not scared, but you still could have a lot of sadness. That it's, so if I say rabattu ala fuadiha, that means I really comforted her all the way. There's no sadness, there is no sorrow, there's no anxiety. And that's obviously not what happened here. Her fu'ad became disturbed and her qalb became comforted, because she still felt the anguish of separation and anxiety and sorrow. So it's actually a very precise expression. If you're writing Arabic well.
Anyone done processing?
That's right.
Okay,
There's a risk this will just be a words.
that's okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. My question is, it relates to what happens when a weak, oppressed people internalize the qasas of those
the
above
oppressor,
them.
yeah.
Because this is, of course, the nature of power, and that's
Right.
what this always happens. This happens today with Muslims.
Yeah.
You say Sharia to Muslims, and Muslims get scared because
Yeah.
they're internalizing Islamophobic qasas. But the relation between the Israelites and the Egyptians, like Pharaoh couldn't have just relied upon brute force, could he? There would have, the nature of despotism is there would have had to have been some Israelites who bought in to Pharaoh's qasas. Do we see that in the tradition or in the Quran? And I'm thinking that the word istadafa, is there enough linguistic flexibility with the term istadafa to have that connotation? Like the Israelites were seeking weakness. They're almost weakening themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, wait too.
Yeah, I mean, the istidaf is rarely, Joe's pointing out that istidaf is rarely just brute force, but the oppressed often internalizes the qasas, the narrative of the oppressor. And the question is, whether we see an indication of that in the Quran. And I think, as we'll see, especially as the narrative of the Israelites is retold in Ali Imran and Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-An'am, you start being introduced to the internalized pathologies of the Israelites themselves. In their for instance, preferring a certain type of food that they think is more consistent with their nature than and saying no, we don't want the food of that was always reserved for our masters. In internalizing a lot of the idolatry of the Pharaoh, even after in internalizing a lot of the racist attitudes, in both in not having the backbone to actually stand up for themselves. I mean, and in some ways, when we say they were lost in the desert for 40 years, as we will come to it, inshallah, it wasn't just a period of punishment. The Quran tells us that it was also a period of growth. It's as if they needed to cleanse the oppression out of themselves for 40 years in the desert before they could any good could come out of them. And it's remarkable because, you know, if they witness this miracle of an entire army drowning, you'd think the transformation should be instantaneous, but it's not. They continue to struggle with the ailments of the oppression they lived with for a very long time to come. So I think the answer is yes, as we inshallah will see, as we come to the stories of the remaining, I mean, because the stories of the Israelites goes on after, of course, Moses. So.
Does Henry have a question?
Yes. Is there chicken today? So, I mean...
Yes, there is chicken.
Cool.
Not the same one,
but... the question is, I mean, the idea of qasas is almost ambiguous. It's very broad because, so I was wondering if, you know, is it meant to be conveyed in its breadth and ambiguity, or is there a more specific notion of qasas? Because for one, there's, I mean, the idea of a story or a narrative, as in how do you frame and formulate narratives, and then there's another aspect of it is which narratives do you decide to tell, and how, like, what kind of narratives do you take as definitive of a message or an identity or whatever that may be. So in other words, one is that the act of interpretation that goes into a narrative, and then the other is just the picking and choosing of narratives. And then the third is, I don't know if there's any, it's interesting how in a lot of, or in one strain of at least, like contemporary philosophy, this idea of nothing makes sense outside of a narrative. Like the Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre idea that in order to make sense, meaning only exists within a narrative, and the Quran obviously gives you a lot of narratives as a way to convey meaning. So yeah, like my question is the breadth and ambiguity of qasas meant to be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I think it is very much like when you're alerting people at the cusp of real transformations. I mean, put it in a different way. Something happened to Arabs who for a long time, the heart and soul of their poetry was flights of fantasy. Their poetry is not about precision in anything. I mean, a lot of the poetry is the heart and soul of the poetry is exaggeration. And yet, something takes place that they very quickly, and we have evidence of it even within the first century, they are attuned to the importance of how memory is preserved and how memory is told. And these types of transformations don't just occur by happenstance. I mean, when they, even with the controversy about the hadith of recording the hadith of the Prophet, because of the concern that it would be confused with the Quran, but still there was a sufficient sensitivity to what narratives are going to be told, and especially when we know later on, much later on, that the way the narratives was being spun about the beginning of the Islamic message in Byzantia, for instance, is drastically different than what Muslims themselves, the narratives preserved by Muslims themselves. And if it hadn't been for the fact that Muslims were diligent about preserving their own narratives, as much disagreement and diversity and conflicting narratives there are, as much as there is, but still they preserved a corpus of what can be collectively described as Islamic narratives. These are, there was a process of acculturation. There was a process by which these people were alerted to things that for the Persians, for centuries, the only narratives preserved were the narratives produced at royal courts. That's it. It was the palace and the narrative of the palace. All other narratives were worthless. For the Byzantines, it was the royal court and the church. Muslims, from the very beginning, are preserving narratives outside the court. And the clergy, as they eventually emerge, never succeed in monopolizing narratives. So even the Khawarij are alert to their importance of their own narratives, and those who rebel against which reminded me to did I tell you about the rebellion of Zubair? Oh, shoot. Okay, I'll come back to that. Let me finish what I'm saying. So, in the same way that Taylor and McIntyre, Alistair, what's his name?
Alistair McIntyre.
Alistair McIntyre. they come to the realization that there is no truth outside the context of narratives, or there's no possibility of truth, or even no assertion of truth. Al-Qasas, in a very drastic way, is telling Muslims, pay attention to both the construction of narrative, the choice of narratives, and that narratives create oppression and perpetuate oppression and challenge oppression, and that but it does it in a wonderfully Quranic way, in that it comes, it tells you a story, and then it just tells you at some point the bottom line, that the only healthy narrative that God would consider a moral narrative is the one that challenges al-ulu and fasad fil ard. Now, it lets you figure it out beyond that. So it's very interesting, because I started out saying that when Al-Qasas was revealed, that Muslims were saying, okay, well, this is going to escalate the persecution against us, because it's very clear to the Meccans that we are, that as far as the Quranic revelation is concerned, it won't let up on the idea, after the death of Abdul Muttalib, and after the death of Khadija, two main pillars, that it won't let up on the idea of challenging the oppressors, or those who are powerful and assert their power against others. But then, what's fascinating about Surah Al-Qasas is that in the various Islamic rebellions after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, let me see if I no, I didn't write it anyway. So when Mus'ab ibn Zubair was Abdullah ibn Zubair's brother, and Abdullah ibn Zubair waged a big rebellion, a serious rebellion against Abdul Malik bin Marwan. And so Mus'ab ibn Zubair is a da'iyah. He goes around trying to advocate the cause of his brother. And so one of his very famous repeated khutbahs that he would give is that he would get up on a podium and he would recite Surah Al-Qasas. And when he would say "Ala fil ard wa farraqa ahliha shi'a" about Fir'aun, he would point to the direction of the palace of the Malik bin Marwan, and everyone understood that he's saying Abdul Malik bin Marwan is the pharaoh of our age. And then I found many other instances where Surah Al-Qasas, that opening language of Surah Al-Qasas, Fir'aun ala fil ard, and that theme of Farraqa ahliha shi'a, is repeated even in Thawrat al-Zanj, the rebellion by the slaves, where they constantly, the accusation is, we're rebelling against those who've broken human beings into factions, one faction dominating the other. I mean, I think again, the that tells us volumes about how these surah were understood closer to the age of revelation than in the scholastic tafsir that we read later on. Although still, I mean, a lot of the tafsir preserve, like Maturidi, for instance, still preserves a lot of the revolutionary character of Surah Al-Qasas. So.
Okay, here's another question. I find it interesting that after Musa killed someone, he turned to God immediately. Do we know where his worship or knowledge of God specifically came from, considering he grew up with the Pharaoh? Was this something he learned from the Pharaoh's wife?
This is actually a really very good question, because this point was noticed by a lot of Muslim scholars, and that Musa's expression when he says هذا من عمل الشيطان, and that he says ظلمت نفسي, and some say that it was his mother, but then that begs the question of where did his mother get it from? And those who believe that his mother was a prophetess, that problem is solved. They say, well, his mother was taught by God. But the majority actually don't say it was his mother. The majority say that this is proof that there are an innate good that is known to human beings that revelation confirms but does not establish. And among this innate good is that killing a human being is wrong. And they always point to the famous story of Habil and Qabil, the sons of Adam. So most say that by the time Moses comes, the laws of Ibrahim are long forgotten. It's been centuries. And that, of course, Moses had not received the Ten Commandments yet. But yet, that it was part of human nature. Some even then go into these like discussions about how, I don't know how true that is, because I just don't know enough. But they claim, or maybe it was during their age, I don't know, that animals know that it's wrong to kill unless it's for a food. And I don't know if that's true or not. I just don't know. But that's a very interesting question, because it's actually expressly discussed. What knowledge is innate and does not need revelation. Murder is an easy case. Most even say that lying and cheating is also easy cases, that most people would innately know that lying. So for instance, when Moses tells the father of his wife that he's killed a man, and they have this sort of hypothetical discussion, if he wouldn't have told him that he's a wanted man, and because that's not very attractive. I mean, if you want to get married to someone, to say I'm actually wanted and I'm a fugitive. And most agree that it's innately the case that people should know that it's wrong to conceal that information and not disclose it. And that anyone that doesn't understand that is falling prey to the devil, regardless of what excuses they use, which is very interesting.
Great. Okay, so we have time probably for one more question. I'm going to combine two. Salam Sheikh, thank you for another amazing and illuminating session. Do you have a comment on the significance of Musa requesting Allah to designate his brother Aaron as an aide, and how does this relate to other personalities in Islam who were not necessarily prophets but given a special distinction by Allah? And then jumping on that question, do we know much about Aaron before this request from Moses? For example, do we know what was happening in Aaron's life while Moses was in Midian for 10 years? Had they kept in touch in any way?
We know that Aaron was apparently raised by the mother, and of course Aaron is a half brother from a different father, and that while Moses was raised in palaces, Aaron was actually raised as an Israelite, and that he meets Moses after they are adults. That Moses eventually, in one of his journeys outside the palace, he manages to actually meet Aaron. About the 10 years, I don't know, but I would suspect if Moses says right away, because he's traveling to visit his mother and sister and to see his brother when he is when he receives the divine revelation. So I would suspect he might, because if he's unless he's after 10 years, he doesn't even know if they're alive, and he's just journeying and taking the risk. There must have been some contact between them. I mean, the other thing that would make me think that there must have been some contact is that Moses suffered from a severe speech impairment. There is a mythology that the reason he suffered from a speech impairment is that he once put a piece of hot coal in his mouth, although that's unlikely, because I would imagine that you would suffer much more than just a speech impairment if you put hot coal in your mouth. But he did have a speech impairment, and he was very conscious of that. And when he asked for his brother, is because he is aware that his brother is a very eloquent speaker. And so if he is aware of that, there must have been some contact. I mean, it's one thing to be aware of it 10 years ago, but he must have been still aware that his brother still can speak eloquently. So his request for an aid is often explained in the context of his speech impairment. That he's conscious of his speech impairment, that he knows that people make fun of him when he speaks, that it takes him a while to speak, while Aaron is outspoken and he speaks, he doesn't pause, he doesn't need to stutter or whatever that speech impairment was. But Aaron, of course, was a prophet as well, according to most, although a minority says he wasn't. But I believe he was. Aside from the speech impairment, it's unusual. I mean, I try to remember if there's any situation where a prophet requests the assistance of a family member with him. I don't think so. But at the same time, I mean, Moses was going to start a revolution, an actual revolution. He was, to just get enough people to rebel against the Pharaoh and to decide to take the risk of disobeying the Pharaoh, knowing fully well that if the revolution would have failed, it would have meant certain death. You know, the pharaohs of the past are like the pharaohs of today. They have no qualms about executing people left and right, like the pharaoh who's in power in Egypt today. So I mean, it is remarkable that even two people can start this revolution in an authoritarian state like Egypt, which, if history books got it right, I mean, it was an advanced bureaucratic administrative state. You know, they could keep track of people and had a very sophisticated system of spies and records and so on. But yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I think on that note, we are at the end of our time.